Welcome to Healthy Mind, Better Future, a podcast dedicated to mental wellness. We are all challenged by psychosocial struggles. Families are broken, jobs are unfulfilling, neighborhoods are unsafe. Poverty and illnesses deter us from quality of life. We're stressed, anxious, and in despair. Healthy Mind, Better Future brings awareness and relief to those with mental health challenges. It offers practical tips for managing stress and anxiety so you can positively function in society. Our podcast panelists are Dr. Adeyemi Fatoki, a board-certified family medicine and addiction specialist, Dr. Caroline Olaleye, a board-certified pediatrician and primary care physician, Dr. Kenneth Soyemi, a board-certified pediatrician and general preventive medicine physician. I'm Funmi Onayemi, your host.
Welcome back to Healthy Minds, Better Future. I'm your host, Dorcas Fatoki, filling in again for Dr. Funmi Onayemi. So last week we started our conversation on imported spouses, a topic that sparked an important discussion on domestic violence. This issue affects countless families, especially those new to the U.S., who may not know their rights or the resources available to them. As always, we're joined by our expert panelists, Dr. Fatoki, Dr. Olaleye, and Dr. Soyemi. Today, we're expanding the conversation with two new guests, Officer Natasha Williams, who has firsthand experience responding to domestic violence calls, particularly in immigrant communities, and Attorney Olubusayo Fasidi, an immigration lawyer who will help us navigate the legal protections available to victims. Thank you all for being here. So the first question, I'll throw it out to Officer Williams. In your experience, what unique challenges do victims in immigrant communities face when trying to report a domestic violence?
In my experience, I would say the main challenge would be the language barrier that comes in before anything else, and then their understanding of domestic violence laws. I assume they change based on where they are or where they come from. So they don't understand the legality of the domestic violence laws here in the States versus international. So that would be the most challenging thing.
I guess it's not that they don't understand English. It's more like maybe the way they express themselves, and they might be timid and too afraid to really talk, or just trying to explain exactly what's going on with them and not wanting to get their spouse in trouble, or thinking that if they speak up, they could also get in trouble.
Right. Not that they don't understand English. It is sometimes that they don't understand English where we will have to call in someone else to actually speak with them. That is one of the major things, the language barrier. People don't understand, and but we have resources for that when we come on scene. We have a language line where you can just speak into it and it'll tell you exactly what the person is saying, or if they don't understand us, we can actually relate those questions through the language line. We can get someone, or we can call another officer that may speak their language. So that becomes the initial that becomes your initial problem when you first enter. But you are correct in saying that sometimes people are scared to actually report it, but that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with their international or their race or religion. They are scared to get their spouse in trouble, but that happens on just any level. So it's not I won't say it's just strictly the immigration community, because it's not. Everybody feels that same way when it comes to domestic violence. It's just that aspect of domestic violence, period. They don't want to get their spouses in trouble. Some of them don't, because they have certain laws where they're from, they don't understand the laws here that actually protect them because they're not used to being protected, if that makes sense.
So who calls you guys? How do the police get involved? Is it the victim? Is it a neighbor? Or how do you, if they're afraid to get their spouse in trouble, how do the police get involved?
A lot of times it's a neighbor, someone's seen something and they would call, and because the spouse or the child is too scared to call, or they don't want to get their family in trouble, or they don't want to be retaliated against, so they're scared to call the police. But most of the time it is a neighbor.
I think most of the time, though, they also are afraid of two big things, two major areas, deportation and also possibility of taking their children. So I would imagine that would you say that your office will have some information to at least have them out there so that they know that because they are not really documented, if you will, that doesn't mean they will be deported when they report domestic violence?
Absolutely. There's different organizations that work with women and children in reference to domestic violence, and they work around deportation and helping them to actually facilitate that. Um, Usually when the police shows up, we may ask for an ID or identification just for the paperwork, but we're not going through the system to actually see if they're documented, if they have their paperwork to be in the United States. That's not our job at that point. And it doesn't end up in that process because that's not our goal. Our goal is to help the victim out. So that is not the function of the police necessarily. We're not ICE. So that's not our function to actually put in paperwork for them to be deported. Now, once it gets in the system, the court system, they have different resources to help them facilitate that and navigate through that, if that makes sense. So there are all sorts of resources for that. And children do get involved. You usually, if you have a domestic situation, you want to put that information in the system. If children were there and if they actually have seen the domestic violence, then that's something that you want to document, and DCFS will look and investigate that. But that does not necessarily mean that their children are going to be taken away from them. Usually there's family and close friends, relatives to actually facilitate that. So just because you have a domestic violence situation doesn't mean that your children are going to be taken away from you.
Just so that I understand, I understand the sequence of events. The first point of contact is the police, correct?
Yes.
Not the sheriff.
Yes.
The sheriff is
Well,
like a resource from the court, from the domestic courts, correct?
well, it depends on what area you actually live in, because the sheriff's department has a police force and they police unincorporated Illinois. So anything that's unincorporated, they actually police that is a part of Cook County. So the sheriff's police that. And if you're in the city or if you're in a small city, your local police will be the contact.
But the same number will be the 911, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
So, I'm just curious so that we just don't think this is all about women. Have you been called to situations where it's the man that's been abused or that's been, that's the victim?
Absolutely. A lot of the times people think whoever is the first person to actually call the police is the victim, and that's not always the case. There's been several times where I've been to calls and it's been the male that's the victim and not the woman. She's facilitating all the violence and the abuse. And the female, she feels like since she's the female and she's the one who's made the phone call to the police, that she's not the aggressor. So when you come on scene, you want to find out who's actually the aggressor and who's facilitating the violence.
So how do you sort out what is what? Let us say there's a lot of he said, she said. How do you sort out who's the aggressor and who's the victim?
Usually when you show up on scene, you're gonna separate both parties, and you may have a he say, she say thing going on. But you're going to separate it. You're going to look at their history, the history at that address. You're going to look for signs of domestic abuse. You're going to look for signs of violence. And most of the time, people, they're going to tell you what happened. You're going to pull a criminal history to see what you have going on at that residence, who's been the perpetrator before. And these are all things that'll help you determine who was actually the aggressor.
Do you speak to the kids? Do you pull the children aside?
Usually if you have a juvenile officer who's actually been trained to actually interview children, then you will. You can get just, you don't want to do a formal interview with the children, but you can just kind of say, were the children here? You know, sometimes the children will speak up and they'll say daddy or mommy hit daddy, you know, they'll say these things, and then you just kind of pull the children to the side until you can get a juvenile officer to actually to do the interview for them.
What are the signs that you look for in the homes?
Usually you look for physical signs of abuse. You can walk inside a house. I'll give you an example where I've walked inside a house and I've noticed that they have a furniture set which includes tables, and the tables don't have any glass in the table. And you wonder why, you know, that table is still there and it doesn't have any glass, it doesn't have any wood or anything on it. So at some point the glass has been removed, and why. So you can ask a question as to, you know, what happened to the glass in the on the table. You know, you have to be observant when you walk in. There's usually always signs of domestic abuse. Someone may have a black eye or you know, a ring around their wrist, something that may not be new. It may be an old bruise that's healed. Usually you want to look closer at them because sometimes they're trying to cover up.
This postcard is largely targeted towards Africans in diaspora. Can you describe your experience with African families, if you've had any?
I have had some experience with African families. And I would say the biggest thing is women not wanting to get their partners in trouble, the victims not knowing exactly how to facilitate and navigate so they're unaware of their resources that they have to actually help them navigate through the court system when they need to report domestic violence. And then you also have women that they're the victim, but the aggressor is their main source of income. So they don't want to, they don't know how they're going to provide for their family and move forward without the aggressor being there. So those are some of the problems that we come across.
Based on our discussion on the previous episode, you know, we talked about people who bring spouses into the country, you know, so there are issues with that they don't know each other very well, and then they get here. Some of those spouses don't have their green card or their papers to be in the US legally. So that way you have the sponsoring spouse, sometimes they're being abusive. And, like you said, they're also the main source of income. So that complicates things because it's like, okay, he's the one that he hasn't filed for my papers, he's abusing me, and then he's threatening me that he's going to report me to immigration so that they can deport me. And I have no money, I have no relatives because usually to the person, like they haven't made friends, and sometimes the abuser would isolate them from other people or from the communities, so their identities are closely tied together. What kind of suggestions do you have, like Officer Williams and then to Attorney Fasidi? How do people deal with that, especially when the identity is so tightly tied to the perpetrators?
Okay, when I would go into a situation like that, and most police, we don't know the system on getting the correct documentation and how they would be sponsored. So we would try to give them some resources to help navigate through that. Like there's so many resources on the Cook County Clerk's office. They have a chat line as well that would offer services. So they can go on there and chat with a clerk that would be able to tell them what they need to do as far as navigating through that to get the documentation that they need. 14 to 20 days, you can get an emergency order of protection against that person, just to have them removed and taken out of the home, just so that you can have enough time to kind of navigate and see what your options are and reach out to different resources that could help facilitate, the documentation portion of it. And there are several legal aid clinics that can help, which are free of charge. So that would be something as well.
And this is we segue into Attorney Fasidi, if she can help us, if we can help navigate us through what kind of help or what kind of legal advice we give to such people who find themselves in such circumstances.
Thank you very much for having me today. And I'm glad Officer Williams went before me, because for the reasons that she already mentioned, that it prevents people from actually reaching out for help. And not reaching out for help is actually more of a disservice to them, because they need evidence of their abuse. So in 1994, Congress passed a law called the Violence Act, which actually provides non-immigrants who are informed of the action, and then they can take retaliatory measures against them. But and the Burma Service Center are actually trained, just to assist, recognize the sign. However, last year, due to a heightened number of fraudulent cases that were filed under the VAWA, that's the acronym for the Violence Against Women Act. So what they decided to do, the USCIS decided to start bringing people in for interviews December last year because of fraud, just to have the local officers examine the applications. However, VAWA is still there. It hasn't, even though with the heightened enforcement, we're still able to apply for VAWA, but we need proof of the abuse. So it's beneficial to the victims to actually reach out to local enforcement. However, we're going to see we're still monitoring how the trend will go, especially for those of us that live in Texas, where local enforcement now cooperate with ICE. So I believe that is going to prevent more people from calling the police when they're in domestic violence situations. So apart from the VAWA, which helps people who don't have their papers to obtain their papers by themselves without the abuser, there's also, what I found is that people who are granted like conditional residency, that's the 2-year green card, who are in abusive relationships, actually don't leave those relationships because they fear they need the abuser to help them file for the removal of conditions. However, there's actually an exception to the joint filing requirement for those people who who are in abusive relationships. So they can actually file for the removal of conditions based on extreme hardship by themselves. So they don't need to remain in those relationships. Then another thing that I have found, like in my practice, are those who are not, because for VAWA, you have to be either the spouse, the parent, or a child of a US citizen or legal permanent resident for you to obtain your green card through the VAWA process. However, there are some people who come in with their spouses who are non-immigrants themselves, and then their spouses are abusive towards them. There's the U visa for victims of crime. So the U visa specifies certain crimes that an individual who has experienced the crime can actually file for protection. And after some, I believe a year or so, they can actually file to adjust their status after some the time frame. So the U visa allows those people who they're married or maybe they're they have a relative, or even they don't even have to have, it doesn't even have to be their relative, because as long as they report the crime to the police, then the police will certify cooperation, and then they're able to apply for legal status while in the United States. So we have a lot of immigration protections for people who are actually in domestic violence relationships, who have experienced domestic violence.
I mean, and I'm not minimizing the abuse that spouses suffer, but like you said, there are some people who abuse the system, so there are some men who brought their spouses in innocently, never abused them, and then it's the woman who is abusing the man maybe psychologically, and then they are filing like fraudulent petitions against them. So how do the men deal with that? Like someone who maybe had a fraudulent VAWA filed against them.
There's really no way for them to. Usually, VAWA, they wouldn't even inform you that the person filed for VAWA to begin with. So it wouldn't affect the men legally, because they're not aware of it. The VAWA unit will not report the situation to the local police, so it's not going to affect them legally. However, what I've found is that they're actually well trained, like the VAWA unit, they're well trained to spot any fraudulent case for the most part, even though some do get away with it. But there's really no way to tell. So maybe now that they're bringing people in for interviews, since December, that would help to at least minimize the fraud. But there's no way to tell. And it's not as if the VAWA, they're going to be reported. So it's just.
When it's a violence involved, you have proof, you have bruises, you have broken bones, you have all kind of stuff that you can show. When it's more, because abuse comes in different shapes and forms. Some are not physical. A woman can emasculate her husband completely and take away all his dignity. A man can just suppress the woman also, or vice versa, and make the other spouse feel so worthless that they are actually depressed, anxiety, and having panic attacks, and literally can even harm themselves because they feel so disrespected, devalued, and lost all their self-esteem. So when it's psychological, how on earth do you prove that to anybody, that I'm being psychologically abused emotionally abused by my spouse? So and what are there any kind of help or resources in that case? Because I don't see the abuser, who is probably the person who is the breadwinner, probably agreeing to go and pay for mental health services for them. So how do they navigate the system?
Okay, so VAWA doesn't protect just victims of physical abuse. In such situations, we have to get really, really creative. So we usually would rely on family members. If they've spoken to family members about the situation, then I try to advise people not to delete their chat messages, because there'll be something, so they're not dismiss any form of evidence that they might have. So what we find at time, another thing is that you have to show yourself as credible. So if there are other things that help prove the credibility of this person filing for VAWA, that is helpful. So let's assume maybe due to the abuse, the person sought like maybe medical help or something, or maybe sought the services of a therapist, would the information from the therapist. Usually we actually request for psychological evaluation, whether it's physical or verbal, is really helpful because the psychologist or the therapist will examine the individual and then they come up with a diagnosis. And usually they are also able to assess for credibility. Like during the session that they have, they will be able to tell whether the person was psychotic or whether they were credible, so that way that helps to prove the abuse, or at least it supports or corroborates their story. So family members, information from family members is very helpful. Usually there's a text, there will be something. So I tell my clients, just bring everything that you have. We're going to sort through it. Then have them talk about their story chronologically. So even if they don't have actual proof of that abuse, we can use other things to show that maybe somebody who was vibrant before, and they have proof of what they were doing before they went into depression, such things can help. I had a guy once who the abusive spouse would draw the image of the head of a Black person. He's Caucasian, he's from Nigeria, draw like fire for, like the person being burnt or something like that, and just put the images on the table. So we use the pictures that this person drew on the table as part of the application. Then also she actually sent a message to him threatening to have him deported. So that was very, very helpful towards proving the abuse and what he has encountered. So in such situation, they really you don't need to have a police report. If it's emotional or verbal abuse, any form of evidence that can show it. If they've ever reported to maybe an authority figure like their pastors, if they're aware of it, that would be very, very helpful. Or if they've chatted in the past, because you have some people who were giving their families information about it. So if they've chatted in the past with their family about what they're experiencing in the relationship, we can use the chat messages, between them and their family members. That would be helpful. Then what some people do is they change phones a lot and then they delete all the messages that they had. Because in addition to proving the abuse, you still have to prove the underlying marriage. So you need communication to prove underlying marriage as well. So whatever it is that you have, even if you don't have anything, that will not prevent you from filing for VAWA. We just have to be creative with the evidence. And the situation would dictate the type of evidence that will be provided. So we had a woman whose husband made her abort her baby, and then she ended up in the hospital. So we're able to show that, okay, she went to the hospital for so and so reason. So at least that helps show that she did go to the hospital for a particular reason. We are presenting the reason why she went to the hospital. So it depends. At that point, you have to be creative with it. And it's also wise to work with an attorney who is trauma informed as well and who understands the process and can help guide you through the situation. So you just have to get creative. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be prevented from filing for VAWA because you don't have physical abuse. No, VAWA covers every form of abuse, even financial abuse. So you have those ones who their spouses don't give them access to funds, so they can show that, or maybe those ones that their spouses don't work and they make them, they are the ones that is the sole provider for the family. So we have, you use that. The domestic hotline, they have a chat that they've labeled Immigrant. There's this domestic violence wheel. So they have theirs that is customized for immigrants. So you see the type of actions that actually constitute abuse when it relates to immigrants. So what I try to do is I use that chat and I refer to some of those things on there and include that chat as part of the packet, the evidence that was submitted to the USCIS.
VAWA means Violence Against Women's Act. So that our audience really understand it applies to males too, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Women doesn't necessarily exclude men, correct?
Yes.
Does it
Yes.
apply to same-sex couples too?
Yes, it does. It does apply to same sex. And I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of men, what I found is a lot of African men don't even know that they're abused to begin with. So you have people whose wives are going through their phones, and they're harassing them, they're isolating them from family members, and they think it's normal behavior. So when I meet such people, I'm like, no, your wife should not be doing this type of things. It's not normal behavior. So this is very important that we're actually educating the public so that way they understand that women being aggressive is not a normal behavior, it's abusive. And the VAWA also protects women and same-sex relationship. Even parents, because you have people who bring their parents in and then they're abusive towards their parents. So parents of US citizens or permanent residents who have been abused by their children can also file for VAWA.
I also feel, though, that many of what we're discussing is very traditional, meaning that, and some of us also come in with these religious beliefs that we cannot, there are some things we cannot do in terms of marriage. You can report your husband, you can report your wife, you can do all of it, whatever the abuse is. So how do we really bring that together in terms of trying to help individuals who are in abusive relationships? When you say, my pastor told me, you just have to pray to God to help your husband understand not to beat you all the time. Or when you say, my mother said to me, oh, no, not in this family, you can't divorce your husband or wife.
Well, for me, I think the first step is just to use some common sense with it, and having people that you can talk to. As a physician, I've had people come to talk to me about their abusive relationships and what they're going on. Even I've had parents whose children brought them in here and just use them like slaves to babysit and don't give them money, don't do anything for them. The first thing is to be able to have them trust you enough to even talk to you, and then to have available resources. You know what I'm saying? So for me, for example, I know I have Attorney Williams that I've called before, like, okay, this is the situation with this patient. What do you advise that I tell them? I've had my colleagues, Dr. Soyemi and Dr. Olaleye, to call when I've had children involved, just to help me understand how to navigate things. And I've also had Attorney Fasidi that I've called off record that, okay, this is what's going on with my patient. What do you advise that I tell them? So that way I'm able to at least give them some guidance before they go and pay someone the money they don't have for a consultation. So that's one way that I've been able to help.
One of the things I appreciate about what Officer Williams also said earlier is the fact that even though they go there, they go to the homes and they try to intervene, they really do not get involved in immigration issues. Many people don't know that. So, and I wonder if Attorney Fasidi would kind of enlighten us on this. Do we have any grounds in which people actually can have some education about what they must do or know as soon as they get into the country, apart from really understanding the American laws?
What we found is that a lot of people get their information from family members. So maybe educating the family members would actually be helpful towards them. Because I had a client once who she was in an abusive marriage up to the point where the guy was kind of like strangling her. And she came to meet me. I told her it was a conditional she was a conditional resident. I told her she could file the application by herself. She didn't need her spouse to remove conditions. But then later on, she decided to remain in that relationship because her family members told her that she needed the guy. So which means she believed them over me that was providing her with legal counsel. So I believe maybe all like this type of program to begin with is a good opportunity, to educate people, the community about it. And also probably, getting the family members involved, educating them as much as possible. We have a lot of what's it called? Like there are a lot of resources. We have local organizations that actually try to educate the public about the situation, that is on ground. But what I found mostly is that people get their information when they enter the United States from their family members. And if the family members if they don't understand the law, the system, they won't be able to educate them or guide them appropriately.
I heard Officer Fasidi mention that, Attorney Fasidi, that Texas is one of those states that's cooperating with ICE, with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I mean, as far as I know, Illinois doesn't. So that's something that I think people need to be aware of. There are some states now that if you call the police, it could trigger like an ICE action, right? Can you clarify that or speak to that a little bit?
Yes, but we'll see how everything is just unraveling right now. So we'll see how it plays out in real time. I believe within the next couple of months, we'll see. In the past, it didn't trigger any form of enforcement action, but we now have counties and county sheriff's departments that have actually signed, to cooperate with law enforcement. Even in Texas now, I believe they've already passed a bill where if you go to the hospital to receive medical treatment, they can actually report your immigration status. So we'll see how that works out when it comes to domestic violence. I haven't seen anybody or heard, even from my colleagues, that their clients were detained because they called local enforcement in a domestic violence situation. I haven't seen that. But what I've seen is that situations where, and that might be the reason why people don't want to call the police on their spouses, because there was a lady who, she was actually, the husband was the aggressor. However, when the police came, she didn't want to report the husband, their permanent residents. She didn't want to report the situation to the police, but the husband went ahead and did so. So when the husband did that, they took her into custody and then put an ICE hold on her. So an ICE hold is a detainer asking the local law enforcement to keep that person in custody until ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, can pick them up within 48 hours. So with that said, I want to just mention that people who, if you're not yet a US citizen and you're an aggressor, it's actually a deportable offense if you're convicted of a crime of domestic violence. So it can actually get you deported from the United States.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you for all of the advice and the suggestions that you gave us. We're going to wrap it up here. I just want to leave with this. Domestic violence is devastating, as we all know, but it's not something you have to endure alone. Many immigrant spouses feel trapped because they believe they have no options. But today, we've learned that help is available, regardless of your legal status or financial situation. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, there are resources that can help. You can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 or seek legal guidance from trusted organizations. Thank you again to our incredible guests for sharing their expertise, and of course to our listeners for being part of this important conversation. Remember, no one deserves to suffer in silence. Stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on Healthy Minds, Better Future.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Healthy Minds, Better Future. Pressures of life can get you down. Don't lose hope. Exercise your mind daily so you can function positively in society for a better future. Continue to join us as we offer tips to navigate your challenges and bring you mental wellness. Your healthy mind is key to your better future. Please subscribe and share our podcast. Someone out there needs encouragement.